The first door in my own kingdom to shut in my face was one I had paid for myself. I stood in the wind behind the great hall with the wind cutting through a beggar's cloak I had bought that morning from a rag seller for the price of a loaf, and I watched the scullery boy look me up and down, the mud on me, the 3 days' beard, the split boots, and decide I was nothing. He shut the door without a word. I heard the bar drop on the other side. I had been Alpha King of Imberfell for 11 years. My name was carved over the gate not 30 paces from where I shivered. And on the night of the Ember Feast, with every hearth in the hold lit and the smell of roast and cider pouring out through the shutters, not one soul in my own house would let me stand near the warmth. That was exactly what I had come to learn. I had grown tired, you understand. Not of ruling. A man does not tire of the thing his blood was made for. I had grown tired of being seen only as the throne I sat on. 11 years of women brought before me in silk, of lords smiling with their teeth and counting with their eyes, of every kindness offered to me the way a man baits a snare. My council wanted me mated. They had a girl chosen, a highborn from the river holds, and a feast set 3 nights hence at which I was to name her Luna before the pack. And I could not, for the life of me, tell whether a single person in my kingdom would have crossed a cold room for me if I had not been king. So on the eve of it, I put on rags and walked out into my own hold to find out. The kitchen door was the last of them. I had tried the almshouse, the tavern, the gate of 2 lesser halls, and been turned from each with varying scorn. A coin thrown once, a dog set loose another time. I came to the kitchens because I was genuinely hungry by then, and because the kitchens of my own hall were the warmest place I knew, and some tired thing in me wanted to be near a fire I had grown up beside without anyone bowing when I entered it. I knocked again. This time a woman opened it, broad, red-faced, an apron like a battlefield, a ladle in her fist like a mace. Marta. She had run my kitchens for 30 years and would have run them for the last king too if he had lived. She did not know me. Why would she? She had seen the king 100 times across a crowded hall, gold on his brow, and here was a filthy wretch on her step with the feast work at its worst hour behind her. "We've nothing for beggars tonight," she said. "Feast night, every scrap spoken for, off with you before I set the boys on you." "A crust," I said. I made my voice low and rough. "A cup of water, mistress. I'll not come inside. I've walked 3 days." "You'll have walked a 4th by morning if you don't move." She lifted the ladle. "We've 100 to feed at the high table and 40 more below, and the king himself naming his Luna in 3 nights. Do you think I've time to nurse tramps at my door? Go to the almshouse." They turned me out. "Then go to the next hold." "Marta," a voice behind her, quiet. "Marta, there's the end of the barley pot. It's only going to the pigs." Marta turned her bulk to speak over her shoulder, and past her, in the red light of the kitchen, I saw the woman who had spoken. "I want to tell you what struck me, and I find I have no clean word for it. It was not that she was beautiful, though she was not the polished beauty of the women my council paraded, but something plainer and truer. A face made gentle by use, brown hair coming loose from its pin, a burn healing on the back of one wrist. It was not her voice, though her voice was low and steady in a room full of clatter. It was that when she said the barley was only going to the pigs, she was already reaching for a bowl. She had decided to feed me before she had been given leave to. She had decided it the way you decide to breathe. And in my chest, where for 11 years there had been a locked and waiting silence, something turned over like a coal breaking open, and a warmth spread out from it that I had no name for and no defense against. A heat like the first fire of the season catching in cold wood, sudden and total and impossible to put back. My wolf, which had watched 1,000 women pass without lifting its head, came up off its haunches all at once and looked at her, and I knew, the way you know your own name, the way you know your own hand in the dark, that she was mine, that she was the one the bond had been holding its breath for. Standing at my own kitchen door in stolen rags, half frozen, I understood that I had found my mate on the night before I was to name another woman before my whole kingdom, and that she was the lowest hand in my own house, and that she was about to give a starving stranger her supper without the least idea who he was. "That barley spoke for," Marta snapped. "For the pigs," the woman said again gently, and there was no fight in it, only a fact, and she came forward with the bowl. "One night's slops won't founder them. Let me, Marta, it's cold as the grave out there." Marta made a sound in her throat, but she stepped aside. I have thought about that since. Marta was not cruel. She was tired and pressed and 30 years deep in the habit of guarding her larder, and there are 1,000 women like her in the world who would have done exactly as she did. And it is not villainy, it is only the small hardness the world puts on us. What is rare, what is so rare that I had waited 11 years and never once seen it aimed at me, is the other thing. The stepping toward, the bowl already in the hand. She came out onto the step. She was not tall, she had to look up at me. And she did look up at me, that is the part I keep. She did not look away from a beggar the way you look away from a thing you'd rather not see. She looked at my face as though I were a man. "Here," she said, and put the bowl in my hands. It was barley and the ends of the roast, chopped small, more than the pigs would have missed. Warm through the clay, my cold fingers curled around it. "Mind, it's hot, there's bread." She had it in her apron pocket, a heel of dark loaf, her own, I understood later, the piece she'd set by for herself when the high work ate her supper hour. She pressed it on top of the bowl. "It's not much." "It's a feast," I said, and I meant it more than she could know. Something crossed her face. She thought I was mocking, perhaps, or she was embarrassed to be thanked for so little. "Eat it there by the wall out of the wind," she said. "You can leave the bowl on the sill. Don't let Marta see you lingering." A flicker at the corner of her mouth that was almost a smile. "Go on." And she went back in, and the door closed on the warmth, and I stood against the cold stone of my own hall and ate the best meal of my life out of a pig's bowl in the dark. I did not name my Luna 3 nights later. I will come to how. But I want you to sit a moment with that heel of bread, because I have turned it over 10,000 times since and it does not wear smooth. She did not know me. There was nothing to gain. A beggar cannot repay you, cannot promote you, cannot marry your daughter to advantage or speak your name to the king. To be kind to a beggar is the purest kindness there is, because it is the only kind that expects nothing back. And she had given me not the surplus, not the scraping, but her own bread, the piece with her name on it, and told me it was not much. I stood in the dark and I wept, which a king is not supposed to do, and then I finished every grain of the barley because she had made it and I could not have left it. I should have gone home. I should have walked in through the front gate, let the guards fall over themselves, bathed, slept, and in the morning told my steward to bring me the kitchen hand who had fed a beggar and be done with it, declare her, claim her, crown her. I did not do this, and the reason matters, so I will give it to you plainly. It was the same reason I had put on the rags in the first place. If I walked in as the king and pointed at her, then everything after would be poisoned by the pointing. I would never know whether she came to me for the man or for the gold on his brow. And I had had 11 years of women who came for the gold. I could not bear to make her one of them. I would rather have lost her than turned her into that. So I did a foolish thing, a thing my counsel would have wept to hear, and I stayed a beggar. I took a room, a real one, a straw pallet over a chandler's shop, paid quietly through a man I trusted who asked no questions. And for the days that were left before the feast, I came back to the kitchen door at dusk as the tramp she'd fed. I told myself it was to be sure. To be sure she was what that first bowl had said she was, and not a fluke, a one-night softness. That was a lie I told myself. I had known at the door that she was, my wolf had known. What I truly wanted was to be near her as no one, as a nobody, and be given the thing you can only be given when you are nobody, the truth of a person. Her name was Eloin. I learned it on the second night when a boy called it across the yard, "Eloin, the cats are at the fish again." And she went and shooed them without hurrying and came back with one of the cats anyway, tucked into her arm, purring, a creature that clearly had her measure. She fed me again. Marta grumbled and let her. By the third night Marta had stopped grumbling and started leaving the pot end out on the sill for me herself, which is how kindness spreads. One person steps toward, and it makes it a little more possible for the next two. I learned Eloin in pieces, the way you learn anyone real, and every piece was ordinary and every piece undid me. I learned that she was the lowest hand in the kitchen, the scullery work, the pots, the floors, the things no one wanted, given always the worst hours and the coldest corner of the sleeping loft, and that she never once complained of it in my hearing, not because she was meek, but because complaining was not, to her, a thing that fixed pots. I learned that she was the one the other girls came to when they cried, and the one the old undercook went to when his hands shook too badly to work, and he was afraid of being turned out, because she would quietly do his portion as well as her own and let him keep his place and his pride. I learned that she saved bread, not for herself. There were 3 children in the wind behind the tannery whose mother had died in the spring fever, and Eloin carried them bread 3 nights out of 7, and told no one, and would have been mortified to be seen doing it. I only knew because I was a beggar in a doorway, and beggars see the things the seen do in the dark. And I learned on the fourth night why. We had got into the way of talking. She would bring the bowl, and if Marta was deep in the high work, she would stand a minute in the doorway with her arms wrapped against the cold and pass a word or two while I ate. She thought me a wandering man down on his luck, a soldier maybe, from something in how I carried myself, and she was too well-mannered to ask what had brought me low. I gave her a name, Cale, the name of a man who'd served my father, long dead, the first that came to me, and a story vague enough to hold. Soldiering, a lord who died, a place lost. Half of it was even true if you turned it sideways. "You folks somewhere?" she asked me that fourth night. "Someone waiting?" "No one," I said, which was as true as anything I'd told her. "You." She was quiet a moment. The firelight from the door moved on her face. "Had a brother," she said, "and our mother before there was a hard winter, you'll remember it, the year the river froze solid enough to walk. The fever came with the thaw." She said it simply, the way she said everything, a fact set down without asking you to carry it. "I came here after. Old Marta took me on. It's a good place. Warm." She looked out at the dark. "Warmer than most." "You feed everyone but yourself," I said. It came out of me before I'd weighed it. "The children in the tannery, Wind, the undercook, me. You gave me your own bread the first night and told me it was nothing." Her head came round quick. "How do you know about the tannery children?" "A beggar sees." She studied me for a long moment, and I braced for her to close, to be angry at being watched. But she only sighed, and something in her shoulders loosened, and she said the thing I have kept above every other thing she ever said to me. "When our mother was dying," she said, "there was no one who'd come. We'd nothing to give, and folk are careful with their nothing, and I don't blame them. But there was a woman, I never learned her name, who brought us bread 3 days running when it was the difference between us eating and not. She never let us thank her. She said, 'You'll pass it on when you're able. That's all the thanks I want.'" Eloin looked at me. "So I pass it on, that's all. It's not a great thing." "It's only bread. It's only bread." She said it the way she'd said it's only going to the pigs, as though the ordinary miracle of feeding a hungry stranger were the plainest thing in the world, beneath remark, when it is in fact the whole of what any god has ever asked of us. I sat in the doorway with the empty bowl in my hands, and I thought, 3 nights from now I am to stand before my pack and name a woman I do not love because my council chose her, and the alliance is sound. And this woman before me, who has nothing and gives it all away, believes she is nobody, and does not know that she has already, without lifting a hand toward it, unmade a king. "Eloin," I said, and my voice was not steady. I nearly told her then. The words were in my mouth. "I am not Cale, I am not a beggar, I am the king, and you are my mate, and I have known it since the moment you reached for the bowl." I nearly said it. And then I saw what saying it would do, how the warmth would go out of her face, and the wariness would come in, how she would drop to her knees on the cold step, how the easy truth between a woman and a nobody would curdle in an instant into the careful, frightened deference between a scullery hand and her sovereign. I would gain the truth of her name and lose the truth of everything else. I would turn her, in one sentence, into every other woman who had ever stood before my throne. I could not do it, not there, not like that. "You're a good woman," I said instead, which was too small and too true. "The winter your mother died, did anyone come for you? After, when you were the one alone?" She smiled, and it was a sad, kind thing. "No," she said, "but that's all right. Not everyone gets a woman with bread. I got the one when I was small, and I've been passing it on since. That's enough for one life." She pushed off the doorframe. "You should eat inside tomorrow. It's turning bitter. I'll square it with Marta. She's soft as her own dough underneath. Don't tell her I said." And she took the bowl and went in. "No one came for you." I lay awake that night on the chandler's straw with the whole shape of my life laid out cold and clear above me in the dark. My council's alliance. The river-hold girl, Seraphine, who was not wicked but who had come to me the way they all came, measuring the throne behind me even as she smiled at the man in front. The feast 2 nights off. And a woman asleep in the cold corner of my own loft who had, in a hard winter, buried her mother and her brother with no one to bring her bread, and had answered a whole life of being unfed by spending herself feeding everyone else, and who believed that this was ordinary, that this was nothing, that this was only bread. No one came for you. Someone was going to come for her. I decided it there in the dark with the certainty I usually kept for war. Someone was going to come for Eloin at last, and it was going to be me. and I was going to do it in the one way that could not be mistaken for anything but what it was. I let the beggar come to the door one more time, the night before the feast. I had a reason. I wanted to give her the choice cleanly before the whole weight of the crown came down on it, and I could only do that as Kale. So I came in the dusk, and Marta, soft as her own dough, just as Eloan had said, waved me to a stool by the inner fire and set a real bowl in front of me, mutton and barley and a hunk of new bread, and told me gruffly that a man who'd walked 3 days ought to have more sense than to walk a fourth, and that if I'd a mind to make myself useful there was always wood wanted splitting, and a place for a steady man wasn't impossible to find in a hall this size. I understood I was being offered, in Marta's rough way, a life. It touched me more than I can tell you. My own head cook, not knowing me, was trying to save a stranger. Eloan sat with me a while when her work let her, and when Marta had gone to shout at the spit boys and we had a moment, I set down the bread and I said, Eloan, if a man had nothing, truly nothing, no name worth the having, no roof but a borrowed one, but he'd found the one person in the world he wanted to spend his whole life beside, would it be cruel of him to ask her to take a hard road with a poor man? Or would it be crueler to say nothing and walk on? She went still. The fire ticked. She looked at the bread between us and then at me, and there was a color come up in her face that had not been there before, and I watched her understand what I was asking, and my heart stood in my throat like a man on a wall waiting for the arrow. A hard road with a good man, she said slowly, is better than an easy one alone. Any woman with sense would tell you that. She was not looking at me now, but she'd want it asked plain. Not hinted. A woman who's been overlooked her whole life, she'd not trust a hint. She'd think she'd mistaken it. She'd think he can't mean me because no one ever has, so he'd have to ask her plain and mean it and not take it back. And if he'd a thing to tell her first, I said, a thing about himself, that might change how she saw him, that he was afraid to tell in case the telling changed everything. Now she did look at me and there was a steadiness in it and the smallest fear underneath. Then he should tell her plain too, she said. Whatever it is, a thing built on a hidden thing isn't built on anything. Tell her and let her choose knowing. That's the only way it's real. A breath. Is there, Kale, is there a thing? There's a thing, I said. Tell me then. And here is where I failed her a little, and I have never quite forgiven myself for it, though she forgave me long ago. I could not tell her there on a stool by the kitchen fire that the beggar she'd fed was the king who was to name another woman at tomorrow's feast. It was too great and too tangled. It would have frightened her half to death and been believed by no one. Marta would have thought me mad and had me thrown out. So I did the coward's brave thing, the thing that was almost right. Tomorrow, I said, at the feast, you'll be serving below. Yes, you always are. She nodded, not understanding. Watch the high table. When the king rises to name his Luna, watch. You'll have your answer about the thing I've to tell you and about the asking. And whatever you see, Eloan, I took her hand, the one with the healing burn, and I held it in both of mine, and I said the truest thing I had. Whatever you see tomorrow, know that you were chosen before you knew you were being chosen. You were chosen at a cold door for a bowl of barley you gave a stranger, and nothing that happens tomorrow made it so. It was already so. Remember that, whatever comes. She stared at me. Kale, you're frightening me. Don't be afraid, I said. For once in your life tomorrow, don't feed anyone, don't fetch, don't carry. Just watch the high table, and when the moment comes, come forward. Will you promise me? Come forward when the king calls. When the king calls, she half laughed, bewildered. The king doesn't know I'm alive. I stood. I had to go before I said it all, before the whole thing came out of me there in the wrong hour. The king, I said, knows exactly that you're alive. Good night, Eloan. Eat your own bread tonight. That's an order from a beggar. And I left her there by the fire with her mouth open and her hand still warm from mine. And I walked out through the wind and did not stop until I was through the small east gate that only the king's men knew, and inside my own walls, and up the stair to the rooms I had not slept in for 4 nights, where my steward took one look at me in my rags and sat down hard on a chest and put his face in his hands. Sire, he said, muffled. Sire, the whole council has been, where in the name of the moon have you been? Finding out something, I said, draw a bath. And send for Seraphine of the River Holds. I owe her a conversation tonight that I won't do her the discourtesy of leaving till tomorrow. And Aldous, he looked up. Tomorrow at the feast, when I rise to name my Luna, there will be a woman serving at the low tables. Brown hair, a burn on her wrist, the plainest dress in the hall. I want her let come forward when I call, and no man's hand is to stop her. See to it. He blinked at me. Sire, who is she? She's the only person in my kingdom, I said, who ever came to a cold door and stepped toward me. Draw the bath, Aldous. I've a great deal to wash off, and only one of it is the road. Seraphine took it better than I deserved. I told her the truth which she was owed, that I could not name her, that it was no fault in her, that the fault was mine for ever letting my counsel put us both in a hall to be matched like horses. I expected anger. Instead, she was quiet a long while, and then she said, with a dry honesty I had never troubled to look for in her because I had never troubled to look at her as a person at all. You never wanted me. I knew it. I told my father it was a cold thing we were doing, and he said cold things build kingdoms. She looked at me. Is it a woman, or is it just that you can't? A woman, I said. Highborn. No. Something eased in her face. Relief, I think. That it had not been a game she'd lost, but simply a door she'd been standing at the wrong side of. Then I hope she's kind, Seraphine said. You could stand some kindness. You've the manner of a man who's never once been given a thing he didn't have to be king to get. She rose, and at the door she paused. For what it's worth, I'd have been a serviceable Luna and a miserable wife, and so would you a husband. Name your kitchen woman de Verl, and when the Riverholds grumble about the slight, send me. I'll manage my father. It's the one thing I'm better at than being loved. And she went, and I thought, I have wronged even the ones I never wounded all these years by seeing crowns where the people were. Eloin had cured me of it in 4 nights and a bowl of barley, and she still did not know my face. I did not sleep. I stood at my window through the small hours and looked down over the dark roofs of my hold toward the kitchens, where somewhere in a cold loft the woman I meant to name before the whole pack was sleeping. I hoped, with a full stomach for once, because a beggar had ordered her to eat her own bread. The ember feast fills the great hall of Emberfell to the beams. It is the oldest feast we keep, the harvest in, the year turning down toward the dark, every hearth in the hold lit from the king's own fire, which is carried out at the end of the night to rekindle the kitchens and the cottages and the almshouse, so that the whole kingdom burns for one night from a single flame. My father used to say it was to remind us that we are one fire or we are none. I had said the words myself, 11 years running, and never once felt them until the year I meant to carry that fire to the kitchen door myself. The high table blazed with plate and candlelight. My lords in their best, their ladies glittering, the Riverholds ranked below the salt with Seraphine among them, cool and composed, and I saw with gratitude, not looking daggers at me but merely waiting, like a woman who has stepped off a bridge she never wanted to cross. Below the salt, the long, low tables, the lesser folk, the household. And at the very back, moving among the servers with trays too heavy for her, the plainest dress in the hall. She had not obeyed me. Of course she had not. Don't feed anyone, don't fetch, don't carry. I might as well have ordered the river to stop. She was carrying. She was the lowest hand, and it was the greatest feast of the year, and there was no world in which Eloin stood idle while others' arms were full. I watched her set down a platter for an old man who could not reach it and fill a child's cup, and I loved her so much in that moment that I had to look at the fire to steady myself. The feast wore on. The toasts, the songs, the old man of the hall telling the year's tale. And then my steward touched my shoulder, and the hall began, table by table, to hush, because they all knew what the night was for. They knew the king was to name his Luna. Word of the Riverhold match had run through the kingdom for a month. Every soul in that hall believed they knew the name I would rise and speak. I rose. The last of the noise fell away. 100 faces turned up to me, gold and candlelit, and beyond them the low tables, and at the back a woman with a tray on her hip who had gone very still, watching the high table as a beggar had told her to. I did not speak of Seraphine. I did not speak of alliances or the Riverholds or the good of the kingdom, all the things my counsel had written out for me on a card that lay untouched by my plate. I said, 4 nights ago, I walked out of this hall in a beggar's rags. You could hear the fire. I told no one. I put on a dead man's cloak, and I went out into my own hold on the coldest night of the autumn, and I knocked at door after door, and I was turned from every one. That is no reproach. I raised a hand as a murmur started. Every door that shut on me was shut for a good reason by a tired soul with little to spare, and I do not blame a single one, and I forbid anyone to. I did not go out to trap my people in their weariness. I went out because I am a king who has been given a great deal, and never once been able to tell whether any of it was given to the man or only to the crown. I went out to find whether there was one soul in Emberfell who would step toward a nobody, not the king, a nobody. Wet and cold, and worth nothing to anyone. I let my eyes go down the hall, past the high table, past the salt, to the back, where a tray had slipped from a hip to a table's edge, and a woman stood with both hands come up to her mouth and her face gone white as ash. I found her at the last door of the night, I said. The door of my own kitchens. She did not know me. There was nothing in the world I could give her back. And she took the bread that was set aside for her own supper, her own bread, on a feast eve when she'd worked since dark and eaten nothing, and she put it in a stranger's hands. And when he called it a feast, she was ashamed, because to her it was only bread. She told me that when she was a girl, her mother died in the hard winter and no one came, and that a woman she never knew brought her family bread and asked only that she pass it on. And she has been passing it on ever since, to the tannery children and the failing undercook and the beggars at the door and every soul beneath her notice. And she believes, she stands there right now believing, that this is nothing, that it is ordinary, that it is only bread. The whole hall had turned. Every face in Imberfell had turned toward the back, toward the plainest dress in the room, and I watched the fear come up in her, the terrible cornered fear of the overlooked suddenly seen, and I made my voice as gentle as I had ever made it, and I said, across the whole length of my kingdom, "Elowant, come forward." She could not move. I saw her want to sink into the floor, into the stone, out of sight. And then Marta, my Marta, who had turned a beggar from her door and then softened and fed him by her own fire. Marta put a hand in the small of Elowant's back and gave her a push not unkind, the push you give someone toward the thing they're too frightened to walk to alone. And she said something in Elowant's ear that I could not hear, but that made Elowant take one step, and then another. They made a lane for her. The lords and ladies drew back their glittering skirts and their fine boots and made a lane down the middle of the great hall, and she came up it in her plain dress with her burned wrist and her hair coming loose, past the salt, past the staring faces, up toward the high table where the king stood waiting, and she looked at me the whole way, and I watched the moment it became certain to her. The moment the beggar's face and the king's face came together into one face, the face of the man she'd fed at a cold door. The man who'd held her hand by the fire and told her she was chosen before she knew. She stopped at the foot of the dais. She was shaking. "You," she whispered, "you where Cale was." "There was never a Cale," I said, quietly now for her and not for the hall. There was only a tired king who couldn't tell if anyone would love him without the gold, and a woman who gave him her bread when she thought he was no one at all. I told you the truth by that fire, Elowant, every word but my name. I told you you were chosen at a cold door and that nothing tonight made it so. It was already so. I came down the dais steps and I stood before her, the whole hall silent as snow, and I did the thing I had crossed 11 years of my life to do. I took off my own cloak, not the beggar's rags now, but the king's own, deep red and fur-lined and worth a village, and I put it around her shoulders, and I fastened it at her throat with my own hands. "I have a thing to tell you," I said, "and a thing to ask you, and you told me I must do both plain and mean them and not take them back. So, the thing to tell you, you are my mate. I knew it the moment you reached for the bowl, not because a seer said so, not because a mark burned or a wolf howled, because a warmth came alive in me at that door that had been cold my whole life, and it has your name on it, and it always will. And the thing to ask you." I went down, a king on one knee on the stone of his own hall before a woman in a scullery dress, and I heard the whole of Imberfell draw one breath. "Will you take a hard road with a man who happens to wear a crown? Not the crown, the man, the one you fed." "I'll not command it. I told you that by the fire, and I meant it. You may turn and walk out of this hall tonight a free woman with my blessing and never see my face again, and no hand will stop you, and I will have gained more than I ever had, which is the memory of a woman who was kind to me for nothing. But if you'll have the man, Elowant, if you'll pass your whole life on to me the way you've passed your bread, then I am asking you plain and meaning it, and I will never take it back." She looked down at me. The tears were running now, but her voice, when it came, was the same steady voice that had said it's only bread, the voice of a woman who set true things down without asking you to carry them. "You gave me back the bowl," she said, "that first night. You washed it and left it on the sill. Cale, a beggar, wouldn't have washed the bowl." "No," I said, "he wouldn't have. I never could stop being who I was raised. Was it the bowl that gave me away?" "No," a wet, breaking, impossible smile. "It was that you looked at me. Beggars don't, mostly. They're too hungry, too beaten down, they take and go. But you looked at me like I was a person every night, and I thought, what a strange, gentle man to have nothing and still see people." She put out her hand, the burned one, and she laid it against my face, there in front of the whole staring kingdom, as though I were a beggar again and she were setting a bowl in my hands. "I don't know how to be a Luna," she said. I know how to scrub a pot and carry a tray and feed the hungry. I don't know how to be anything grand. Then be exactly that, I said, and be my Luna while you do it, and Imberfell will be the best-fed and best-loved kingdom under the moon. Is that a yes, Aloan? Say it plain, you taught me the rule. It's a yes, she said. It's a yes, you foolish, freezing, bowl-washing king. Get up off the cold floor before you take a chill, who'll feed you then. And the great hall of Imberfell, which had held its breath through the whole of it, broke not into the polite applause of a court, but into a roar, the roar of a whole pack that has watched its king kneel to a kitchen maid, and found, to its own surprise, that its heart was in it after all. I rose, and I drew her up with me, my cloak swallowing her small frame, and I turned her to face them, my hand over her burned hand, and I said, Imberfell, your Luna, Aloan, the woman who fed a stranger her last meal on a feast eve and called it nothing. And they cheered her name until the candle flames leaned. I looked for the scorners because a man does in that moment. I looked for the ones who had made her small, but there was no cruelty to punish, and I found I did not want any. Marta was weeping openly into her battlefield apron, cheering loudest of all, a woman who had turned a beggar from her door 4 nights past, and would spend the rest of her life proud beyond measure that she had also, in the end, softened and fed him. The kitchen girls Aloan had comforted were on the tables. The old undercook whose work she'd quietly carried had his shaking hands raised high. Seraphine, below the salt, was watching with something on her face that was not envy, was, I think, a kind of relief on Aloan's behalf, one overlooked woman glad to see another one finally seen, and she caught my eye and inclined her head, and I bowed mine to her, and a debt was settled between us without a word. The only faces with any shame in them were a few of my own lords, the ones who had smiled at me for 11 years with counting eyes, and their shame was the quiet, useful kind. The kind that makes a man go home and look at his own kitchen door differently. I let them keep it. It would do them more good than any humbling I could hand out. That is the truth about the scorners, I have found. The world humbles them better than a king can if the king will only stand aside and let his joy do the work. We were mated by the old rite before the moon set, there in the hall with the whole kingdom for witness. She would not let go of my hand the whole night, not from fear now, but from a kind of wonder, turning it over, tracing it, as though checking that the beggar's hand and the king's hand were truly the same hand. They were. They always had been. She had been the only one to see it. Late, when the hall had thinned to embers and song, I carried out the king's fire, the single flame that lights the whole hold on ember night, and by the old custom I should have carried it first to the high altar. I did not. I carried it, with Aloan beside me in my red cloak, out through the passages to the kitchen door. The same door. And I knelt on the same cold step where I had eaten barley from a pig's bowl, and I lit the kitchen hearth of Imberfell first, before the altar, before the hall, before anything, so that the fire that would spread to every cottage and every cot, and every beggar's borrowed room in my kingdom that night went out first from the place where a woman had stepped toward a nobody in the dark. Why here first? Aloan asked me, watching the flame catch. Because this is where the kingdom's real fire is, I said. Not in the hall here. It's been burning here the whole time in you, and I never knew until I froze at this door. Every fire in Imberfell tonight will be lit from this one. That's the truth of the feast, Aloan. We are one fire or we are none, and you were ours all along, feeding it, and no one saw. She leaned her head against my arm, and we watched the hearth take, and she said, because she could not help it, because it was who she was, there's barley left in the pot, you know, if you're hungry. King or not, you looked half-starved 4 nights, and I don't imagine one feast's cured it. So I sat on the cold step in my crown with my Luna, and she filled a bowl, a real one this time, not the pig's bowl, though I confess I kept that one and keep it still on a shelf where I can see it. And she put it in my hands and told me out of ancient habit that it was not much. It's a feast, I said, the way I had it the first. And this time she knew I meant it, and this time it did not make her ashamed. It made her smile, the whole true smile, the one I had walked out of my own hall in rags to find. That was many years ago now. We have kept every ember night since the same way, she and I, and it is the only royal custom I have ever added to Imberfell, and the only one I will fight to keep. When the king's fire is carried out, we do not take it to the altar first. We take it to the kitchen door. And there on the cold step, before the whole watching hold, the Alpha King of Imberfell kneels. Yes, still. An old king's knees and all, and with his own hands he serves a bowl of barley and a heel of dark bread to whoever stands at that door hungriest, whoever the kingdom has overlooked that year. The tramp and the widow and the tannery child groan and the stranger down on his luck. And beside him stands his Luna, who was once the lowest hand in his kitchens, and who still, every single year, checks the bowl is warm through before it leaves her hands, and tells the one who receives it that it is not much. It is much, it is the most that we have. It is the whole fire of the kingdom, carried out into the cold from the one heart that never stopped feeding it. I learned that at a shut door on the coldest night of the year, from a woman who thought she was nobody, and I have been king a long time now, and it is the only thing I know worth teaching. And so each ember night I kneel at the kitchen door and teach it the only way it can be taught, with a warm bowl in cold hands given for nothing, to someone the world walked past. Mind, it's hot, there's bread,